that long. Thank you very much.
So Reza, what I want to ask you is, I read your book and I enjoyed your book very much. No God but God. You talked about the need for Islam to reform itself from within. Obviously, you think that there's hope for that to happen. I'd like you to talk about why you think that Islam can do that, and is there anything that we can do other than stand by and wait for it to happen?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. What Rabbi Rosenbaum is referring to is the sort of central thesis of my book, which isn't that Islam can reform itself. It's that we are witnessing and living through the era of the Islamic Reformation, an era that has been going on for some 150 years, and actually an era that we are witnessing the twilight of. Now, I use this term Reformation quite deliberately. I understand that there are some very distinctly Christian, very distinctly European connotations to this term, connotations that are simply not applicable to some of the very complex socio-political conflicts taking place in the Middle East and taking place between the Western world and the world of the Middle East and the Islamic world. But the reason I use this term is because I want to strip it of those connotations and to remind an audience that Reformation is a universal phenomenon. It is a phenomenon that we have seen in the history of many great religious traditions, in Hinduism, in Judaism, in Christianity, and that at the heart of this conflict, the heart of this argument that we call Reformation, is a debate over who has the authority to define faith, who has the authority to define a religion. Is it the institution or is it the individual? That conflict exists in all great religious traditions, and in some certain eras of social or political strife, that conflict rises to the surface, bursts to the surface, and often involves a great fracturing, even a geopolitical fracturing of a religion and of its wider community. But what this means in the Muslim world is that whereas for 14 centuries, the institutions, the clerical institutions of Islam, and of course, unlike Christianity, Islam has never had a single institution and never had a pope or a Vatican that speaks for all the world's Muslims, but it nevertheless has had 4, sometimes 5, people will say, schools of law, institutions that have maintained a virtual monopoly over the meaning and message of Islam for the last 14 centuries. And over the last century or so, particularly since the colonialist experience, as Muslims around the world were forced to define themselves not so much as members of a worldwide community of faith, but rather as citizens of individual nation states. Nation states, I remind you, that were often created through arbitrary borders and somewhat fabricated nationalities. Nevertheless, that sense of individualism and nationalism began to really take hold in the Arab and Muslim world. And there was a great challenge to the institutions that they themselves could not define Islam anymore, that authority rested in the hands of individuals. Now, there's a problem with this, because we tend to think of reformations as a good thing. But there is no real value placed on the phenomenon of Reformation. Reformation just simply means the individualization of a religion, the anti-institutional movement that occurs in so many religions. And when you say that the authority to define faith doesn't rest in the hands of institutions, it rests in the hands of individuals, then as you all know, you're opening up a whole can of worms. So that means any individual, with any kind of social or political agenda, any kind of bias or prejudice, now has the authority to define their religion, their scripture, according to their ideologies. So in the case of Islam, you have radically individualistic versions of Islam that are pluralistic and reform-minded and democratic and very modern, even westernized in some sense. And you have individualized versions of Islam that are deeply intolerant and puritanical and even violent. And because, unlike in Catholicism, there is no Muslim pope who gets to say which interpretation is correct and which interpretation is not, it's often the case that the loudest voice is the voice that gets heard, and you frankly cannot get much louder than ramming airplanes into buildings. Now, 2, 3, 4 years ago, that phenomenon, the individualization, the radical individualization of the Muslim world, was a cause for celebration in some ways, because it was that coupled with this demographic that I was referring to, the 75% of the Middle East that's under the age of 35, that gave confidence to so many of us studying the region that these marginal movements of extremism and of intolerance, that these movements were going to be swept away inevitably by this very nationalistic, individualized versions of Islam. But because the situation has changed so dramatically over the last few years, and because jihadism has been so on the rise, that rabid individualism is now a cause for grave concern. Because there is nothing that needs to unite these people under a shared idea. Jihadism itself is in many ways the perfect product of this Islamic Reformation, because jihadism is a deeply individualistic, violently anti-institutional movement. In fact, bin Laden says over and over again, you do not need to listen to your clerics anymore. You do not need to listen to your imam. You don't have to go to mosque anymore. They have nothing for you. They've been adulterated. And because of the internet, which very clearly parallels the printing press in the Christian Reformation in bringing ideas and new sources of knowledge and theories available in ways that were simply unimaginable. Because of that, we're now faced with a situation in which we have a very young, very disaffected, marginalized, individualized, deeply nationalistic population who is now looking for alternative sources of leadership. Not the leadership that their mosque gives them, not the leadership of their parents' generation, but any kind of leadership out there that speaks to their individualized needs. And right now, the most obvious answer to that question for a lot of disaffected Muslims, young Muslims, is the voice of jihadism. Because like all fundamentalisms, jihadism provides very, very easy answers to very complex questions. So this Reformation is not something we're waiting for. This Reformation has been going on for quite some time. But as we learned, those of us who remember or who have studied the Christian Reformation, it's a very long, very bloody, even apocalyptic process. And it's hard to say where we are in that process right now. But I think it is important to recognize that process is taking place.
How welcome is your moderate, possibly even, dare I say it, liberal voice in the American Muslim community? Is there still room for dialogue?
It's a very good question. Thank you for asking that. It may come as a little bit of a shock to people in this room to know that Islam is currently the largest religious minority in this country. There are probably a little bit less than about 10 million Muslims in the United States. The largest non-religious the largest non-Christian religion in the United States. And yet, the Muslim American community here, unlike the community that we see in Europe, is thoroughly integrated into almost every level of society in the United States. 60% of Muslims in the United States own their own homes. The median income for a Muslim household in America is greater than for a non-Muslim household. In fact, Of course, of that 10 million or so, there's some 20 to 30% that is referred to as African American Islam. I'm not referring to the nation of Islam. I'm just referring to African Americans who have converted to Islam. So that 70% of that is an immigrant community.